As we get closer to next year's general elections, you will see many adverts focusing on what your politicians are planning to do to improve the country. Inevitably, some will stray towards populist messages, which tend to polarize groups and sometimes blame certain communities for the societal ills that we're facing. And this brings me to a really fascinating yet quite disturbing experiment that's recently been conducted. The Legal Resources Centre, in collaboration with the advocacy and rights group Global Witness, recently approached 3 social media platforms, TikTok, Facebook and YouTube, and the aim to see if, obviously, anti-foreigner content would actually be approved. So did they get blocked or not? Let's find out from Kristen Abrams from the Legal Resources Centre. Thank you so much for joining us, Kristen. You know, it's cheeky, but it's effective. And I wonder, before you tell us what was approved or what was not approved, tell us about the 10 ads you made, which incidentally we're not playing because they are offensive. 10 ads were made. Tell us about the messages, the languages they were created in, etc.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sally, for having me on tonight. So we created 10 ads in English that had unequivocally disturbing content that was geared toward refugees and migrants in South Africa and had extremely xenophobic content. This content was then translated 10 more ads into Afrikaans, and then we did 9 in isiZulu and 9 in isiXhosa. So the ads, and of course we aren't repeating them or putting them to the public, but they were they alluded to migrants being cockroaches. Some had incitement to violence, where there were calls for the police to shoot and kill migrants in South Africa. Others had extremely offensive racial slurs. And then we used real-world examples, hashtags from campaigns that were online and in South Africa. And all of those were passed. Facebook disapproved 2 ads. And those were the English and Afrikaans versions of the ads that compared refugees to animals. But the same ad in isiZulu and isiXhosa were passed. YouTube and TikTok approved of all of the ads.
Wow, I mean, that's quite an indictment. I've got to ask, is this in clear violation of their own rules for their social platforms?
Yeah, so what we had to do before was research exactly what the social media companies' policies said in terms of hate speech and incitement to violence. So each company has a different definition, but the content that we created was such an easy test to pass. It was unequivocally in violation, flagrant violation of their policies, especially in relation to hate speech and incitement to violence.
It's interesting that only 2 adverts were stopped, and those were for Facebook. Now, Facebook, we know, tends to draw an older generation. Is it fair to say it's more conservative? Are its rules perhaps stricter?
I mean, I don't know if it's fair to say it's more conservative. So we've done the study now with Global Witness, and Global Witness has run similar studies. This would be over the 10th time that they've done it. But what their findings show about Facebook in particular, firstly, that they perform really poorly every time these ads are tested. But secondly, that Facebook seems to be putting more effort into moderating content in some countries as opposed to others. And I think that's the worry here, that users around the world aren't being treated equally, and content moderation isn't being given the same resourcing or prioritization in some places as opposed to others.
And what's really interesting about this is that the English and Afrikaans versions were stopped, but the versions in the 2 other languages, I think you said isiZulu and I can't remember the other language you mentioned, were not stopped, which also suggests we have a problem with people understanding nuanced and perhaps even not so nuanced, destructive, xenophobic messages. I mean, let's not forget in Rwanda, the messages on one of the radio stations was comparing a certain group to cockroaches. And that message went far and wide. What has Facebook said to you about the fact that they banned 2 and let other 2 back? I mean, have they actually come back to you about this?
Yeah, so they didn't respond to the two adverts or to the other 36 in particular, but they did give a general response. And the response was that they are aware that there are cases where they would sometimes miss or take down in error content because humans and machines do make mistakes. And I think that goes to your point about languages, because how we understand the content moderation policies as working is that machines are actually trained, computers are trained to flag violated content, and then human reviewers review that content. But these social media companies are so opaque about how these systems actually work. So, for instance, we aren't sure what languages the computers are trained in. And then we aren't also sure of how many of their content moderators speak certain languages or are familiar with our South African
Yeah.
context, for instance.
And really what you've described is a two-point system for trying to flag problematic content. And this is not just a mistake. You know, basically 90% of these ads were approved. This is the norm. That's the reality. Bearing in mind that we're building up for our elections, just today we had our Provincial Police Commissioner talking about the problem of foreigners in Diepsloot. Yes, people who don't have their documents officially are breaking the law, but there's a vast difference between someone who doesn't have their documents and someone who is committing rape and murder. And it worries me that those two are often conflated. So it's so easy to pick on a specific group when times are tough and to point the finger of blame at them. Bearing in mind the results of this experiment, that we're coming up for an election, do you think that it's provided the wake-up call that we need for social media?
Yes, so I think in particular in relation to migrants and refugees in South Africa, the expectation is that as we get closer to the election, that the incidence of xenophobia will rise. I know that the UN human rights experts have advised that South Africa is on a precipice of an explosion of xenophobic violence. And I think what we know from previous experience is that a lot of real world harm, xenophobic harm, has actually started online. So even if we think about Operation Dudula, that emerged online and then served as a catalyst for so much real world harm that took place. But I think and we did this investigation in particular in the lead up to World Refugee Day. But what stands true is that the social media companies can let through hate speech and incitement to violence against any group. It could be LGBTQ. It could be racial groups, for instance. And the issue is that there is not enough effort that goes into content moderation, and then particularly leading up to an election year. If we recall what happened in the US around elections and how disinformation was spread over social media, that's another thing that has to be countered. And so it's disinformation, hatred, incitement to violence, all of those things that we are actually asking them to put their efforts into curbing and actually removing from their platforms.
Yeah, and it's absolutely a slam dunk for you in terms of proving the point that more needs to be done. I really hope that you, with your collaboration, continue to test the levels of observation, making sure that this harmful content does not make it online. Kristen Abrams from the Legal Resources Centre, thank you so much. All right.